Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for spending your time with me today. My name is Liz Engoff. I am an educational psychologist out here in the Bay Area, California. And today we're going to be talking about explaining testing results to children, having feedback sessions with children after an assessment is complete. This is the first of a three-part series. Today we're going to be talking about the model that I use to approach feedback sessions with children of any age. The next week, we're going to be talking about the Brain Building Book, which is a tool that I use with younger children to talk about testing results. And then the following week, we're going to be diving into some more complicated profiles. So let's get started. So explaining testing results to kids is tricky, and it's hard for all of us. I was able to send out a survey to a couple hundred psychologists all over the world and talk to a few dozen of them. And the information that I got back really fell into a few key themes. So these are some of the challenges to effective feedback with children that seem to be true for all of us. The first is language. Finding the right language to talk to a child that is at their level and understandable and accurate to what we're trying to communicate and is positive and empowering to them and doesn't make them feel like there's something wrong with them. The second was attention spans. Young children have short attention spans to begin with. And then on top of it, a lot of the kids that we work with, attention and language are impacted. So it makes it even more challenging to really engage them in a conversation about some pretty important stuff. The third one is overwhelm. It is so easy to overwhelm adults with this information, never mind a child. How much do we share? The fourth is time. A lot of the psychologists that I spoke with had strategies for talking to kids about their testing results and had done PowerPoint presentations or different activities, written up stories, but when they transition to a busy private practice or just the practicalities of being in a busy school system, they didn't really have enough time to put together those kinds of presentations. And feedback really needs to be individualized. There's a ton of metaphors out there, but they don't always fit every kid. And then the fifth theme that I heard that makes feedback challenging is parents. And this was because a lot of parents had worries about talking to their child about a label, about their child having a label and what that would do to their self-esteem. And a lot of parents had struggled with similar challenges that their kids have. So it brings up a lot of stuff for them. It's pretty triggering. It's really hard as a parent to watch your child struggle. And the other piece was that parents didn't have the language. I mean, we barely have the language to be able to talk to kids about these things. And so parents didn't really have a way to keep talking to their child, especially not in that positive, empowering way that we really want, so that kids can start to integrate their concept of themselves into their everyday life and learning. So it really begs the question, why try? Why not wait till kids are older? In fact, I heard this a lot, well, I don't explain testing results to young children. I wait till they're 14, 15, till they're, more into high school. And that way their attention span's longer, their language is more sophisticated. But when I went into private practice, I worked in the school system for a long time, and then I went into private practice and I started working with more adults who had a history of learning disabilities and were now applying for graduate school or wanted work accommodations. And I would ask them, what is your learning disability? Tell me more about what you know about the way that you process information, the way that you learn. And so often I would get, I don't know, they just put me in a different classroom, or I was kind of a lazy student, or I just didn't like school. I was kind of dumb. Um, and then we would go through the assessment process, and I would just watch the light bulbs go off, and they would start to unpack what actually had been going on, that they process things differently, that their teachers might not have understood how they process things differently. And they would say, I'm not dumb. Like I just look at the world differently, and I was misunderstood as a child. I was in a bad fit. And not only are my processing differences not my fault, and not meaning that I'm dumb or broken in some way, but these differences are actually the reason for my successes and my talents. It's all part of the same thing. And it's so empowering to watch an adult rewrite the narrative that they've been telling themselves since childhood. But I realized this has been decades of this negative, harmful narrative. So we need to start this as early as possible. Very young children know something is awry, and they start to develop those narratives in their head for what's going on. And it's often not a helpful one. And so I realized that through this assessment process, we have this opportunity to define the language that a child will use to describe their relationship to learning for the rest of their life. These conversations are not optional. We have to start them early. So, with this newfound motivation, I dove into talking to kids about testing results, and I will have to tell you, it did not go well at first. So I had a lot of kids with that glazed over look, a couple kids who ran crying from my office, which was not ideal. And then I also had some kids who we had those magical made for movie moments, but it seemed to be more dependent on the child being ready than on me doing anything specific. So that sparked this multi-year journey of just trying to figure out, how do we do this right? And as I said before, a lot of us weren't trained. So when I talked to colleagues, they were just as lost as I was. So I started looking at, what do I know from my training that helps us talk to kids about hard things? First, and foundational to my approach to working with kids, is collaborative proactive solutions. This is the work of Ross Greene. And a few elements that are important to this conversation are that the child's perspective on what is hard and why it's hard is critical information for figuring out how to solve the problems that they're facing. The second piece comes from my cognitive behavioral training, and I studied with a practitioner named David Burns, who has a model called Team CBT, and he loves to ask the question, what beautiful and amazing things does your anxiety or depression or negative thoughts say about you? He also puts a lot of emphasis on figuring out what problem the client, or in this case the child, actually wants to solve, which may be different than the problem that their parents or their teachers want to solve. Of course, the language of growth mindset from Carol Dweck is fundamental to the idea that we're building our brains throughout our lifetimes. And finally, the therapeutic assessment literature that addresses feedback directly. And in this approach, Steve Finn talks about the different levels of information that we share and how to think about what will be easiest for the client to process and what will be more difficult. Perhaps the most transformational piece for me from this literature was the idea that feedback is most effective when it's integrated throughout the entire assessment process, so that the information the child gets at the end is not a surprise, but something that we discovered together. So now that I had kind of a grasp on those theoretical frameworks, I started to realize the mistakes I was making. And this is how this framework was built. So the first mistake I realized I was making with feedback with children is that I was thinking about feedback as separate from the testing that I was doing. Second is keeping my reflections to myself during testing, thinking, well, I don't want to tip them off to whether they're doing well on things or doing poorly on things, because that will mess with standardization or it will make them feel bad. And of course, I'm not interrupting the test itself, but when kids do really poorly on something, they know. And they might try and hide it or try and move on, but they kind of know that didn't go so well. And when they do really well on something, often it's exciting and they like it. Their brains really like it. And getting that input from them was so critical. Like, hey, that was really hard. What was that like for you? You look like you had a really good time with that one. What was that like for you? The third one was assuming my job was to reveal the answer at the end, that I had to take all this data and kind of crunch it and then come back with the answer, as opposed to working with the child to make sure that I was coming to a conclusion that made sense for them as well as for their parents. And then finally, thinking that if I do this feedback session right, that kids are going to understand their diagnosis in one session. That's what we would need. Just realizing that was an unrealistic expectation. That these concepts are so complicated, and this is not how learning works. Learning doesn't work by just one moment. It works by repetition and being able to apply things in different ways. And so I needed a way to set up adults so that they could continue that conversation, as opposed to focusing on how do I do this right, and thinking it was just relying on me. So, these mistakes turned into this framework that we're going to go over. And so this framework has 4 parts. The first is that feedback starts before intake. The second, building a shared language. The third, surprises suck, stay away from them. And 4, needing that continued conversation. So let's dive into what these mean. Right, so feedback starts before intake. I want to tell you that every single handout that you see here, everything that I'm talking about today, those links will be in a description after this video, or will be accompanying this video. There'll also be a copy of the slides available. And if you're watching this video and you don't have an email from me with a link to the slides, please just send me a note and I will send you a link. All the links to these documents are at the end of the slide deck as well. These are all available for free. So feedback starts before intake. So what do I mean by this? There's a concept in the literature on feedback in general for adults that feedback starts at intake. So at that first intake interview, you are planting seeds for where you might be going for your feedback, or where that you might end. And planting those seeds helps to see how your client or the parents are reacting to that, and whether it feels like it fits or it doesn't fit. And so how you're going to help to get them to different places if the information is consistent or not consistent with kind of the ideas they're coming in with. And also allows you to test different things out. But I realized that all of this seed planting and all of that, it actually, for the child, it doesn't start at your first session with a child. It starts before they come in. It starts the moment that their parent or a teacher tells them, you're going to be going to see Dr. Liz to do some different activities. And when it's set up as, oh, you're going to go play games with the psychologist and you're going to win a prize, and then come back, that doesn't set us up well for feedback, because if the child thinks that they're coming in to play games and then I invite them in for a feedback session and say, look what we learned about your brain, there's going to be a real disconnect there. So how do we give parents, caregivers, teachers the language to really make sure that the child knows what they're doing? We write it down. So this handout has a number of scripts on it that really explain what we're doing and give specific language so that adults can set the context for coming in to see you. It gives them questions to ask to help them identify the problem that the child wants to solve. It gives them language to model curiosity about the process. And I really have been wondering what's going on for you when this happens. I know that you've been working so hard. I've been trying different strategies. Homework is still a pain for both of us. I'm really curious what's going to make it better because I'm out of ideas. And also to show that it's not just about the child. I need to know how to do things better as your parent. I need to know how to do things better as your teacher. And this is going to help me. And it's going to help you know what to do differently and help you learn about your brain so that you know what to ask for. And then we're both working together on this. The second piece to the model is building a shared language. And to do this, I use a handout with a picture of the brain. And if you have the brain building book, these pictures are also in the book that they end up taking home. And I've found that it's not only helpful to hear how children are describing their strengths and challenges, but also to give them language to start asking the questions that they're the things that they're curious about. Because whatever question they ask, that's where my feedback session is going to start. And however they describe their strengths and challenges, that's the language I'm going to use to help them understand what we learned. I introduce a metaphor of highways and construction zones, and I make sure to talk about what they've already built, because I'm really integrating that growth mindset language into this process. That they're building their brain, even while they're with me, they're building their brain. We're always building our brains. It's always under construction, even when you're an adult. So we can talk about the things that you're building, because it's not about you being broken or having some kind of deficit or being wrong in some way. It's about figuring out what do you want to build next? You've already built a lot. What are we building next? So the parts of the brain, the handout that you saw, as I said, there's a link to it either in the description of this video or at the end of the slide deck. And I'll say your brain is made up of a lot of different parts. Each part has a different name and a different job. So what are some of the things you like to do? Which would be a standard question I would ask in a intake interview regardless. What do you like to do? Tell me about yourself. But then we look at how does the brain help you to do those things? And the point here is to help a child see that the parts of their brain are working together all the time, and they're all involved. There's no broken part here. There's no broken piece. They're all involved, and we already are kind of getting our feet wet talking about the brain. And then I want them to start asking questions. I want them to get curious. So if you've assessed anybody in the past year or two, you've probably had a conversation about Minecraft. And so for this particular child, he said he loves Minecraft. And so we talked about the way he might be using his brain to play Minecraft. He's listening to the zombie sounds to hear when there are threats coming. He has the key patterns that he's pressing on the thing he uses, and knowing which buttons to press fast enough and getting really automatic at that. He said that he sees everything And he has to know where the diamonds are. And he also has to make a lot of decisions and really think through about mining and exploring and make a plan. So he's really using this part of his brain for that. And this helps us to start talking about things, introduce vocabulary, and then start to get questions from the child. I also introduce the emotional brain because a lot of kids, whether there's an emotional processing question or not, if you have a learning issue or social challenges, these things get very frustrating. And so there's usually some piece of it that we're talking about. For kids who are more impacted in their emotional processing, we come back to this at the end to really talk about what's going on in their brain when they're having a hard time. But again, this system is also very helpful. So when you have an overactive amygdala, when you have sensory processing challenges, there's a lot of things that are hard. But this system it doesn't mean the system is broken. And it is really helpful to you as well. So this was part of our conversation about using your emotional brain for Minecraft, and that your brain is going to call up certain memories to say, what do I know about this? Your emotions are going to chime in and say, oh, God, danger, got to get out of here, or no, let's go for it. So kind of introducing the idea that there are kind of these other automatic systems in here that are going to influence what we do as well. So as I said, I use a metaphor of highways and construction zones. And so I explained to the child that your brain works by sending messages from one part to another using special cells called neurons, and that the neurons connect to each other, and it's kind of like little billions of tiny roads in your brain. And so when the messages are traveling really fast and easily, it's kind of like your highways, big fat highways in your brain. And when the messages are traveling and when it's harder for them to get from one place to another, you can kind of think of that road as more under construction. It's something that you're building. And I actually use these plush neurons to make that real. And these are great. They're fun for kids of all ages, from kindergarten all the way up through high school, just to kind of see this cartoon version, and we can kind of show that the neurons are making connections, and that connection might be tenuous or it might be really, really strong, just to give that visual. And for younger kids, this becomes a great fidget. And also during testing, every time we finish a subtest, we do a little neuron high five, and we do a little that the electricity is flowing through because they just finished something. So that just makes it kind of fun. And I'll put in the comments where I get these guys because they've been really awesome for this process. So as I said, some of the things are easy for your brain. We can think of those as highways, and some are more challenging. We can think of those as construction zones or the skills that you're going to be building. So trying to get kids to ask assessment questions. Now they have this vocabulary, and we can kind of ask them, all right, what have you already built? What are some things you're proud of? And then what do you want to build next? What questions do you have? What do we want to work on? And I found that I love this idea of getting kids to ask assessment questions, but I found it was actually really hard. Like what do you want to know from this process? A lot of kids didn't know how to ask, especially younger kids. They didn't know how to ask that question. So I started to realize there were certain kind of ways that I could get different types of questions out. And to be honest, I don't really care if the question sounds like a referral question or not. I just want kids to be asking any question at all about their brain, about learning, about feelings, about school, about home, about riding a bike. I really just want them to start asking questions because that's going to help me set up a feedback session. At least I know where to start, even if they're having a hard time asking the question. So a couple of different types of questions. One is brain questions. Is there anything you'd like to know about the brain in general or about your brain specifically, now that we've kind of gone through all of this? I love compare contrast questions because even if a child's not like saying they have difficulty with something. There's always something they like better than the other thing. Or something that's harder than the other thing, or something that somebody says is one thing and they think is another thing. And these become great questions. So an example would be, you're saying math is hard, but your teacher actually told me math is a strength. Is there some part of math that's challenging? And then that can be the question. Why are math facts so challenging when the rest of math is easy? You said you love to read but hate to write. Can you tell me more about that? And then there's any number of questions in there, but it could just be, why do I love to read and hate to write? That would be a great assessment question. As I said, the next construction project. So a lot of times it just is very vulnerable for kids to talk about things that are hard. And when I first started doing this, we'd write down all their strengths and I'd say, okay, well, what are some of the things that are hard for you? And it happened more than once that a child would say nothing and then actually cross out all the things we had written down that were their strengths. And they'd say nothing's hard and nothing's easy. And I was so curious about this, but there was something like, it was the moment when they caught on to the fact that we were looking for something that was difficult for them, and maybe we were going to find out something that was broken or wrong. And so instead I inserted this other line of questioning that was, what are some things that used to be hard that aren't hard anymore? Because just by establishing that they're growing and changing made it a lot easier to talk about the next construction project. So an example, your parent said that your reading has really taken off. What's your next construction project? So, and I might be kind of hoping they'll say writing, but we can get there kind of using this line of questioning. And it's a lot easier to talk about the things that are hard once I've just told you how awesome I am at the other thing. The reframing boring or bad at. So this is another way that kids might not be saying this is hard for me. They'll say it's not hard. I've had this conversation a couple of times. It's not hard, it's just boring. So, but that is a question. I wonder if we can figure out what would help it be not so boring. And then other times kids might not be invested in getting better at something. I'm just bad at it and I don't care. When you said you're bad at science, I wonder if we can figure out what's making it so hard. I'm not saying we have to change anything, but it would be interesting to know what is making it so hard, just in case. And often, even the most reluctant kids are willing to just investigate to see what's there. All right, so what do these questions actually sound like? So Alex is a kid I'll talk about today. Alex came in because there were questions about ADHD, potentially questions about autism. Some of the social challenges were there. And so throughout our interviews, we talked about a lot of different things. And what was really interesting is that Alex, during our second session, he adamantly declared that I do not have ADHD. If you were even thinking that I have ADHD, I want to tell you now I do not have ADHD, so don't even talk about it. And that was the primary referral question from his parents, so we had to figure out how are we going to talk about this? But through our interviews, we got these questions. I said, talking about things going on at home. And he said that he gets in trouble for moving around a lot and kicking his feet in this particular way that annoyed his parents. And so we came up with, why do I move around when I'm idle? Those were his words. Why do I move around when I'm idle? Why do I kick my feet? And he said he got in trouble a lot, but he didn't always know why. And this was the question that came out. Why am I sometimes good behaviored and sometimes not? And then in class, he'll often call out, and we were talking about that, and he says, I'm just very spontaneous. And so we came up with, why is my behavior so spontaneous? And this was great language because I knew it was going to be really hard to talk to him about his ADHD diagnosis afterwards. But if I could use this language, we had already agreed that these things are hard. And then we get to reframe and teach him what ADHD means, as opposed to whatever this idea was that he had in his head. And then I thought he was hysterical, but at some point he said, most people don't find me that funny. And even when I'm trying to make jokes. And so we came up with this question: why don't people always understand my jokes? And this is what told me that he was ready to hear the social piece of his profile. If this hadn't come up, we might not have gone there, because it's a lot to do ADHD and then look at that. We were looking at the autism question. And so, but this tells me that it was something that was on his mind and a question that we really needed to answer for him. Another child, this is more of an emotional evaluation. This child was asking how to focus better in school, especially online. This was one of these compare contrasts. Online was just way, way harder. When we talked about emotional challenges, she was saying that, it's not my fault. My parents flip out too. And then like, they're supposed to be the ones that stay calm. I'm not supposed to be the one who stays calm. And so we came up with this question: how do we all get better? And this was really important. It wasn't just about her, that was about everybody. And then when I was asking about friends, she said that she didn't have any problems with friends. It's like, oh, that seems like a really good question, right? And she said, yeah, I don't know why I get so mad at my parents, but I don't get mad at my friends. So these are great starting points for our feedback session. All right, so part 3 of this model is that surprises suck. So we want to avoid surprises. And to do that, we're taking all of that language that we just got from our assessment sessions, and now we're going to put it together for the actual feedback session. So this is the planning sheet that I use to plan my feedback session with a child. And I will write in the highways and the construction zones that we talked about during our session, and anything that I found in the report that I know is going to be consistent with what we already talked about. If there's something that's new, then I need to really consider, is this going to be brand new? Because I don't want any surprises at that feedback session. Maybe it's something for later down the line that I share with a therapist, share with parents, share with a teacher, to have that conversation, let that unfold down the line. But I'm really wary of putting anything on here that didn't come from our conversation and isn't related to what we already talked about, because they won't be able to process it. They'll get overwhelmed really quickly. The helpful words, that's going to be my diagnosis. Sometimes it is a specific diagnosis. Sometimes it's going to be other words that help, that are going to be kind of vocabulary to explain what's going on. I'm really thinking, what happens when this child leaves my office and goes to their teacher or goes to a family member and says, guess what I learned about myself? I want to make sure that they have the words to say that, to be able to answer that question for themselves. And then tools and construction crew, this is just the recommendations from your report, and letting them know anybody new that they're going to be working with, if they're getting new intervention or if they have an IEP. So our goal is that there's no big reveal. We're answering their questions and really staying there. That's how we prevent overwhelm, by making sure that we're sticking to the questions that they asked. We're using the child words. This is how we get the language and how we keep their attention, because we're reminding them of things that they've already said, and it's a lot easier to process. And then we're going to personalize the diagnosis. This is how we help them to understand what's going on, using those highways and construction zones, letting them know they're not alone, that there's lots of people who have the same kinds of patterns, and other people have done this before. And then we're going to talk about building their skills and how we can support them moving forward. So this is kind of what the assessment summary would look like for Alex. Again, this is my planning sheet for the feedback session. But I forgot to say that once I've done this, parents started asking for this, and it becomes a great cover sheet for your report. And if you're presenting at a meeting or an IEP, This is a great handout to everybody, and teachers love this thing because it's the language that they can turn around and talk to the kid and use the same language. They don't have to translate. It's such a nice, easy summary of all of our psychobabble and our reports. Um, and yeah, just the key information. It's also a lot easier to put up on a Zoom screen if you're doing virtual meetings, way better than a report in paragraphs. So anyway, this is what it looked like for Alex. He did really, really well on puzzles and patterns. He had an amazing vocabulary. He had a really hard time with memory tasks when it was a full story, but he was able to remember small chunks, like the memory tasks that were just little pieces of information, like a list of words. He killed it. And so we had talked a lot about how his memory works best when he can remember small chunks of information. And this is a great example of reflecting to the child during the testing session. So I gave him the memory test, and after the stories, he had he kind of knew that he didn't remember anything, but then he did really well on the word list with those little chunks of information. So after we were done with that, I asked him, how did that go for you? And he said, I forgot all the stories, I spaced out. But, and I said, well, how did you feel about the list? That was a lot easier. It's like, well, let me tell you, I agree. Those stories were pretty hard for you. Like that was a pretty tough task, but you did really well on that word list. That was something your brain like really absorbed that information. I think, does that feel like that's true about your brain, that when things are in small chunks, that works for you? But if it's like a lot at once, it just doesn't. And he said, yeah, when teachers talk on and on, I can't for the life of me take in anything. But so-and-so, he, like my teacher, my science teacher, does things in bullet points, and like, I really get it. So, so this was an important piece that came out of just reflecting after, like during the testing. And just that he's just like so eager to participate. There's a spontaneous behavior, but it's definitely like he is an eager learner, and we wanted to call that out. And then you can see his language reflected here. And then I added fine motor skills because he was going to get intervention for fine motor skills because his handwriting was definitely trying, and we wanted to teach him to type. And so, and I put that on there even though we hadn't discussed it, because I knew that he was aware that his handwriting was not awesome. And so it wasn't going to be a stretch, even though it was technically new. It was not new news to him at all. So, I look at these highways and construction zones, and then I kind of have a sentence frame for how I put the definition of the diagnosis together. So remember, we're explaining ADHD, and this is the child who said, I do not have ADHD. No way, no how, don't even go there. We had to go there so we could answer his questions. So this was a really awesome way to redefine ADHD for him. He had this idea that ADHD meant that you were bad behavior, that you had bad behavior and that you were out of control. And so I told him, listen, in our work together, we learned that your brain is built in a way that makes puzzles, patterns, vocabulary come easily, and that spontaneous behavior and paying attention much more difficult. So, but it turns out you're not alone. This pattern happens a lot, and we have a name for it. So now that we know, our job is to maximize your superpowers and find a way to build those trickier skills so that the hard part gets easier. Let's make a plan. So obviously in practice, this sentence frame gets massaged and changed a little bit, but this is my starting point. This is kind of how I'm thinking about it. How do I take what we've already talked about as their strengths and their challenges and bring those together to help them understand their diagnosis? So this is what it's going to look like for Alex. So we know he ended up with a diagnosis of ADHD. And for him, ADHD means his brain is built in a way that makes puzzles, new words, curiosity, and awesome ideas come easily. It's all his eager learning, right? definitely part of his ADHD brain is that incessant curiosity and wanting to know more and just jumping on every new concept. But turning on your attention for boring things, sitting still and waiting your turn to share, much more difficult. That's what ADHD means. You can see the like, oh, Alex, like, that's what that means. That's what that means. Sometimes, so the other piece was the social skill piece, right? And so we were looking at autism, and for a number of reasons, I did not come away with an autism diagnosis. I still wanted to monitor him. This was at the height of the pandemic, and I didn't have all the data that I needed to really give an autism diagnosis. So it was in kind of in process, monitor for like let's keep an eye out. And for school purposes, he was going to get social support and intervention on his IEP. So that's kind of where we ended up. So this meant that I needed some other way to talk to him about the social challenges since he was not fully meeting criteria. We weren't giving him a diagnosis of autism at that time. But I knew he was ready because he asked that question. Why don't people understand my jokes? And so I told him that some people with awesome vocabulary and a lot of knowledge don't always land their jokes. This is called difficulty with pragmatics. So pragmatics was his helpful word. So he could turn around and say, I have a great vocabulary, but I have trouble with pragmatics. And that's why I'm here in this group. That's why I'm going to this activity. And he kind of thought about that and reflected, and he said, I see. My jokes take off, but they don't always land. Which, again, it's just an awesome reflection. So we wrote that down too as part of like his explanation and his helpful words for really understanding his brain. And actually, side note, I was at an IEP meeting where he attended, and this is what he shared with the team. He said, I want to work with the school psychologist because my jokes take off, but they don't always land, and I want to land more of my jokes, which I thought was pretty awesome. Another example for Sam. So Sam ended up with a pretty complex mental health profile. But at the root of it was really this anxiety. And in talking to Sam, I started to see, and we started within our session, started to define what was Sam's experience as anxiety. And so this is the word that we shared. And anxiety means your brain's taking in a lot of information at once. And in our conversation, that included realizing when friends were having a hard time and picking up on when things were kind of out of sorts, but that it can be hard to process it all. And this is when you might get stuck or flip your lid. And so that related to the question about the family and that everybody was flipping their lid, which is the Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain and flipping your lid. And so she said, I get it. It's a pain to have anxiety at first, but once you learn how to use it, it's really helpful. And with great power comes great responsibility. So she was starting to see that her anxiety was part of the thing that made her so amazing, as well as something that was causing some challenges. And so her goal now was to learn how to use her anxiety to stay motivated and stay connected with people, but not let it take over and paralyze her. So some other helpful words. So when the question often comes up, what if parents aren't ready to share a diagnosis? Or what if it's not like we shouldn't be sharing a diagnosis with a child at this time? Or what if it's like a really tricky diagnosis? Or I often use some of these helpful words. So organization, time management, motivation, big feelings is a great term for anything, especially for young children when there's a mental health concern there. Self-regulation is another very general term, but can be applied in many ways. Again, for some of the, for kids with more explosive behaviors, that are part of the referral question, often we talk about gear shifting and being able to shift from one concept to the next, or being able to incorporate new information quickly. And then processing time is a big one. And so the question I'm always asking in my head is, what skills are they building? How are we going to describe that? And also, what do I imagine them saying if a teacher said, "Oh, what'd you learn while you were with Dr. Liz?" And I want them to be able to have the words to answer that question. So if you're playing along at home, you can kind of give this a try yourself. So one of the links that you have is a handout for a child-friendly diagnosis. And this handout has some vocabulary on it for ADHD, as well as anxiety and autism. Pretty soon, dyslexia and autism. Pretty soon I'll be adding anxiety, and then some ways to explain behavioral concerns. So hopefully those will be added to that Google Doc soon. On there, you'll see that there are some strengths, some kind of common strengths and common challenges, and then some examples of this sentence frame and kind of how I've explained these diagnoses to children in the past. And so you can kind of think of a child who you've worked with recently who has an ADHD profile, and really challenge yourself to think, how would I fill this in? How did they describe their strengths? Really thinking about using the kids' words. How did they describe it? And how did they describe their challenges? And can we bring those together to make sense, help the child make sense of what ADHD means for them? Once you've explained the diagnosis, a lot of times it's really helpful at this point in the feedback session to introduce the "you're not alone" part. It not only breaks up the session and to give them a book to look at or a little video, but it's right after they've been told, they've been given a diagnosis. Like that's a big moment. Even when you've built it up and you've been planting seeds along the way, to get that label, that's a big deal. And for a lot of kids, it can be a huge relief. Oh my God, there's a name for what's going on, thank goodness. But there's a lot of conflicting emotions in there. So learning that this is common enough for some people to have written about it and made videos about it, and that there's a list of famous people out there with this same pattern, with this same kind of brain, is really, really helpful. So I put together this tools for explaining testing results. This is actually a spreadsheet with multiple tabs. So I have pulled up the ADHD tab because we were just talking about ADHD. But there's also a tab of resources for autism, dyslexia, emotional challenges, giftedness, other things, general, just talking about general learning differences and developmental differences. So please check this out. Again, the link is going to be in the notes or at the end of this PowerPoint slide deck. And the two for ADHD that I love the most are the ADHD comics and How to ADHD. So there's a link on there for the top 10 things I love most about having ADHD, which is just a great video that this woman, Jessica, put together. And I love showing it at feedback sessions, especially when to have the parent and the child watch together, because the parents inevitably are like, yes, that is so you. Did you get what she said? Oh, and that one too, that's you. And it's just a great way to end the session, because it's the parent who's just so proud of their child for being this amazing ADHD brain. And it's a really cool moment. The ADHD comics are also awesome because there's so many of them. And there's always a few that really ring true for this child's experience to kind of bring some levity to the moment. Some favorites for autism, there's a video called Amazing Things Happen, and then Understanding the Spectrum is a comic strip, or a little comic with a character named Archie that can be really helpful. Dyslexia, I love the Seeing Dyslexia Differently video, same thing, just pointing out the strengths and a lot to connect to. And Made by Dyslexia has a ton of famous people, videos of famous people talking about their experience with dyslexia. The hand model of the brain, of course, is just a great metaphor for everybody to use. And there's a cute animation called Why Do We Lose Control of Our Emotions that uses that. So, so this brings us to the last piece. So now you did the testing session, you did the before testing, you did the testing sessions where you're building that language, you did the feedback session where you made sure that you were repackaging things and defining them using the child's language, so there was no surprises there. Even though you're introducing a new term, it doesn't contain anything surprising, and so the child's able to process it. Now we need to make sure that the conversation doesn't end at your door. Because if you don't set the child up to be able to continue that conversation, or if you don't set the adults up to be able to continue that conversation, then the feedback is not going to work. It was a fun session, but most children are not going to carry that forward unless there's that common vocabulary. So the reason that we use these tools to write on, the reason that I have this one-page summary, and next week we'll talk about the reason that we have the book is so there's a concrete take home that parents and teachers and kids can keep referring back to remember the experience. So it's worth adding in here that during your feedback session with the child, you can continue to annotate and add to the brain drawing to help drive home some of those key pieces of their profile and the things that are really important for them to know. Understanding is a journey. It's not a single event. And so being able to understand these concepts and then understand it in the next situation, to be able to generalize, it's really important to have that consistent language throughout, giving everyone the same language to talk about it. And we're also encouraging self-advocacy. I have had more and more kids bring their brain drawings to an IEP meeting or to their teacher to say, look, this is what I learned about my brain. And for some kids, just that act of being able to say, look at this, is their first step towards self-advocacy. Look, I want to tell you there's something really cool and neat about my brain and the way that I process information. And then that sparks the conversation with the teacher with, oh, wow, that looks cool. And it is just a really affirming way to start that. Oops. So as I said, that's all the content for this video. But next week, or for part 2 of this series, we're going to be looking at the Brain Building Book, which is the tool that I developed for younger children around elementary school age, about 5 to 11, that really brings these concepts to life and walks you as a practitioner through step by step with the child in a really engaging way. To make sure that you're building these concepts throughout the assessment session. And then for the feedback session, you're completing the book and they walk out with this like product. So join us next week to learn more about that. If you already own it, we'll be walking through it, but it's not a prerequisite. You don't need it in your hand to do into the next part of this series. And I do have a coupon code until the end of September 2021 for 10% off if this tool could be helpful for you in your practice or your school. All right. As I said, resources are here at the end of the slide deck. These are all the things that I referred to throughout. These are all available free on my website. And then I included some resources for some of the things that have been influences to me if you want to look further into those. So thank you so much for giving me your time today. And for helping kids to build their brains. You're the dedication, I mean, your dedication, the dedication I've seen from professionals for really making sure that kids understand their brains in a positive and empowering way has just blown me away. So thank you so much for what you do. And please reach out if you have any questions. Take care.